Week 7, Lesson 1, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. This week, we're going to look at the rise of Marvel. And the main reason for the rise of Marvel from a secondary publisher to DC's main rival is thanks mainly to the writing talents of Stan Lee and the artistic talents of Jack Kirby. In the field of comics, it's nearly impossible to overestimate the importance that these two had in saving both the superhero genre and the comic book industry. After the comedic movie star team of Abbott and Costello broke up in 1957, and before Paul McCartney and John Lennon's success with the Beatles' international stardom in 1964, there was a very short time where Jack Kirby and Stan Lee were arguably the greatest and most important pair of talents in American entertainment. But it was a long and improbable journey to get there, full of hardships and uncertainty. So let's take a look at it from the beginning. Jack Kirby is arguably the most influential artist in American comics, and he's such an important figure that I could dedicate an entire course to him. He was a pioneer in many genres of comics, producing cinematic techniques that influenced generations of artists. He helped create storyboards for the fake film Argo during the Iranian hostage crisis, and helped create some of the most important comics the industry has ever seen. We've already gone over some of his contributions in past videos, which I don't want to retread too much on. So the following is a very brief summary of his career up until 1961. Jack Kirby was born Jacob Kurtzberg in 1917 and died in 1994 at the age of 76. He was born into a poor family of Jewish immigrants who came to the United States from Austria. His father worked in a factory and barely made enough to get by. Kirby lived in the Bronx, in one of its tougher neighborhoods, where a gang of other kids would constantly try and beat him up. During this time, he read a lot of science fiction stories and watched a lot of movies for escapism. Jack Kirby was mainly a self-taught artist, copying styles he saw in newspaper comics. At the age of 21, his parents needed more income to get by, so he went out into the workforce and started showing his sketches around. He was always an incredibly fast artist and could draw with amazing speed. He worked as a minor animator for Fleischer Studios, but apparently he found that job unfulfilling, since he was just putting together pieces of someone else's vision. Eventually, he worked for Fox Feature Syndicate, a comic studio where he would write limited stories and comic books, where he would get paid by the page. The pay was not good, which meant that many backgrounds and comic book panels were not that detailed. In order to get more pages out, many artists would cut corners. One infamous incident during his time with the studio was that the manager saw Jack Kirby writing the word wham on a panel. He asked him to explain what he drew. Jack Kirby explained that the wham onomatopoeia was part of the story, and that the bolded word was so that kids would see the excitement of it. The manager actually approved of this excuse, and liked the fact that his comics had more wham in them than the competition's. During this time, he ran into a man named Joe Simon, who had been in the business 4 months longer than Kirby had. Simons was impressed with Jack Kirby's artwork and his work ethic, and asked him to work on some projects with them. One of those projects was Captain America, which we've already dedicated a video to. But Kirby's art style caught the eye of many competing artists, especially with how loose and original his panels were, with the character's movements seeming to come right off the page. This had many imitators, and Timely would continue to use Jack Kirby's style for the book, even though he left the title. Despite the success of Captain America, Timely's owner, Barton Goodman, explained that overhead expenses cut into profits, leaving almost nothing left for Kirby and Simon. Today, this practice is known as Hollywood accounting. This obviously upset the artists, but they were under contract, so they couldn't do much about it. However, National Comics, better known as DC Comics, wanted the team and offered them $500 a week to make comics for them. Kirby and Simon accepted, but had to do it in secret so they wouldn't lose their jobs at Timely. At DC, they finally made a hit with Boy Commandos, who were briefly mentioned in a previous video, a group of kids that went to fight the Axis overseas. These characters were a hit, selling over 1 million copies. Unfortunately, Timely comic editor Martin Goodman had to deal with his wife's cousin, who was a little kid that ran around the office of the building in a hyperactive manner. This youth's name was Stan Lee. He somehow found out about Jack Kirby and Joe Simon's work at DC Comics. And, while there's no proof that Stan Lee told on them, Goodman found out and fired both Kirby and Simon, leaving Stan Lee to take over the Captain America comic. As war broke out, Jack Kirby was drafted and spent his time as a scout, drawing the enemy's positions. When he survived the war, he came back to America to find out that the subjects that he liked to draw were no longer selling. In 1946, when the war was over, Kirby teamed up with Joe Simon again, drawing for smaller publishers like Harvey Comics. In 1947, the two finally found a hit with creating Young Romance, which helped successfully kick off the romance genre in comics, which spawned dozens of imitators. Taking the romance genre away from the humorous teenage genre like Archie and making it more dramatic for the comic book medium. He was doing very well until EC Comics created controversy in comics, which caused romance comics to get sucked into the controversy, along with the more noticeable crime and horror genres. When Bill Gaines shut down EC Comics, the comic distributor went out of business, causing some smaller comic publishers to go out of business as well, including Prize Comics, the publisher Simon and Kirby were working at. Despite the major success of their comics, both Simon and Kirby were making next to no money. When an attorney got involved, it turned out that one of the publishers they worked for, Crestwood Comics, owed them $130,000 in payments for their last 7 years of work. Crestwood only paid them $10,000, and that made Joe Simon decide to leave comics and pursue work in another field. Kirby could not find work outside of comics, which he felt gave him enough creativity to be fulfilling. With that, in 1958, he returned to Timely Comics, now known as Atlas Comics, where, this time, everyone worked as a freelancer, with the exception of Martin Goodman and his relative Stan Lee. Stan Lee is the most important comic book writer of the Silver Age, and arguably the most influential comic book writer of all time. The importance of his work cannot be overstated. He has given America some of its most famous characters and stories of the 20th century. But for the first 39 years of his life, he didn't make a significant impact in the industry, and looked like he was on his way to just being another writer who'd be forgotten by history. Stan Lee was born Stanley Martin Lieber in 1922. He was the son of two Jewish Romanian immigrants who moved to America to get a better life. He was an active child who loved to write, and one day dreamed of writing the great American novel. In 1939, Stan Lee worked as an assistant in Timely Comics, where he helped his cousin's husband, Martin Goodman. At the age of 16, he was officially hired by Joe Simon, probably just to keep Goodman happy. At first, he was an errand boy, making sure the ink was filled, grabbing meals, and so on. In 1941, he wrote his first text story for comics, in Captain America issue number 3, where he introduced Captain America's shield-throwing move. The story was also the first time he used the name Stan Lee in a publication. Stan Lee was a pen name based on his first name. Stan Lee wanted to only use his real name, Stanley Martin Lieber, when he created the great American novel. That way, people would not hold his making comics against him. In 1941, when Jack Kirby and Joe Simon left Timely, Stan Lee, at the age of 19, took over the writing duties for Captain America. Martin Goodman made Stan Lee intern editor at the time, which he proved very good at. In 1942, Stan Lee entered the United States military, where his skills as a writer and cartoonist were noticed. He spent the war writing slogans, working on training films, and creating manuals. After the war, Stan Lee went back to work for Timely Comics, writing for Martin Goodman again and acting as editor. However, by the mid-1950s, with the restrictions that the Comic Code Authority placed on the medium, he was feeling unfulfilled in his role as a writer. With lower comic sales, the industry became more cutthroat, as in 1957, Martin Goodman got rid of the entire staff of Atlas Comics, with the exception of his relatives, Stan Lee, and Stan Lee's younger brother, Larry Lieber. All the other staff there would only be employed as work for hire. When Timely Comics became known as Atlas Comics, they were doing monsters in a science fiction setting. The only comic book heroes at the time were boring, one-dimensional do-gooders with little lives outside of saving the day. The target market was pre-teens, so nothing too complex or adult could be written. Sales weren't improving enough to secure a future in the industry, and Stan Lee was starting to get older. By 1961, Stan Lee was 39 years old, and even though he'd been working in comics almost his entire adult life, he decided that it was time to move on. And this is where our story could have ended. Stan Lee talked to his wife, Joan Clayton Bucock, who was supportive of him leaving, but mentioned that if he was going to quit anyways and had no future plans for a career in comics, then he should do the type of story that he always wanted to do before he left. Stan Lee went to Jack Kirby, and together they collaborated to create one last experiment before Stan Lee planned to leave comics forever. But, as we'll see in the next video, this comic changed everything.